So for the benefit of those who are simply listening on the recording, just to say welcome again to everybody to the latest in our GameShift pop-up events. And we're delighted to welcome GameShift Research Fellow John Higgins and his fellow author Mark Cole, who are here to talk about their book, which is hot off the press, 17th of April, I think it was, and currently racing up the charts, particularly in the sociology rankings. So we're delighted to have you here, and you're going to talk about it. And I certainly know from when we've been asking people if they'd like to come to this, there's been a huge amount of interest. It feels like you're really tapping into something. But before we do anything else, I wonder if, John, perhaps you could kick off by introducing yourself and then handing over to Mark.
Hi, so my name's John Higgins, and I've worked alongside GameShift and have been their research fellow for some years now. And my long-running fascination has been into the use and abuse of power, which is all wrapped up in the relationship we have between voice and silence. And in terms of my understanding, I think in terms of my sort of life story that has really had big influence on me, I think in 2004, I walked away from a successful career as a business school person to become prime carer for my daughters. And that was really where I first experienced existential choice. And it's also where you suddenly have the experience of, when you go back into the workplace, of being silenced. Suddenly all your history gets written off. And I think for a lot of women returning to work, that's quite a sort of recognizable experience. But I'm quite rare amongst the men of my generation to have actually hit that firsthand, to suddenly have my identity erased and suddenly not being able to talk about a lot of my history. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, John. So my name is Mark Cole. I've worked in and around the NHS for close to 40 years now, which makes me somewhat one-dimensional, perhaps. But in terms of T-shaped skills, there's depth rather than a great breadth. But my experience is in a range of roles in terms of development, so people development, employment development, organisation and leadership development. Those are the sort of roles I've been active in. And like John, the thing that really piques my interest, particularly these days, is thinking about power. In the context of the workplace, we talk about power quite comfortably in a range of other social settings. We can discuss it in family settings. We can talk about power in our communities. We talk about social power and party political power. But when it comes to the workplace, we tend to tuck it away and not talk about it. So the great joy of working with John is to have the opportunity to foreground the ideas of power in the workplace and to encourage people to talk about that, whereas in most cases there's a conspiracy of silence around power. And that obviously leads John and I into this area of work around voice and silence. I will just take the opportunity to draw attention to a supreme irony that I'm presently struggling with, or have been for quite some time, but it has worsened just recently, which is I'm diagnosed with something called a laryngeal dystonia, which is a fancy name for, you know, when you get one of those ticks in your eyes or a little twitch that keeps going all day and you think, oh, I wish that would stop, it's really irritating. Well, I've got something like that in my vocal cords, which means that sometimes the vocal cords are open when I'd like them to be closed, and sometimes they're closed when I'd like them to be open. As my speech therapist said the other day, at that point, you've stopped breathing. I thought, oh, lovely. It's not just that I can't speak, it's a near-death experience. So I hope the quality of my voice doesn't affect the quality of your experience today. Presently, it's not too bad. If it's really bad, it does sound particularly difficult. But as my wife tells me, my only talent is to get up on my hind legs and go blah, blah, blah. So it's a bit like Alan Partridge, you know, don't take my chat away from me. So presently I'm just about coping, but I just thought I'd mention it because otherwise you could spend the time thinking, what is wrong with his voice? So that's what it is. Philippa.
Well, thank you, Mark, for sharing that with you. I love the idea of get up on your hind legs and blah, blah, blah. So you've written this book. It's just come out. It's really topical given everything that is going on just now. And, you know, how we like to run these things is to have our guests say something for 20 minutes or so, and then to open it up to conversation, to questions, because really, as ever, the power is in the collective experience that we can share. And I know for both of you, your research is continuing, and your interest is, the book may be written, but your interest in the stories and the conversations continues. So perhaps we could just ask each of you, and maybe Mark, start with you, just around to tell us something about the stories or the themes that matter most to you in the book. And please do feel free to plug it. We have no BBC impartiality requirements here, so feel free to say its name several times.
Okay, thank you, Philippa. Yeah, so the book is called Great Unheard Work. It's quite interesting. Routledge, the publisher, they didn't like that title because they said, well, leaders won't buy it off the back of that title. But John and I felt it very, very strongly encapsulated the way in which we wanted to think about the work we were doing, particularly as we moved into a phase of doing some research to ground the book. It was very clear that we were listening to people that felt unheard, and there was a large number of people in that setting. And so we really wanted to hold on to that title, and then the subtitle is Understanding Voice and Silence in Organizations. The book was fantastic for John and I, and it is particularly interesting for us in terms of our professional development, because it was very much about finding our way through the writing of it. So we had previously written a book, which is also available, called Leadership Unraveled, a spectacular title, taking apart the faulty thinking behind modern management. But this book was more of a practical minute-by-minute exploration of the topic in terms of the methods we started to use, the challenge we met to each other, the way in which we tried to think as we went along. And as Philippa intimated, one of the real excitements is you tend to think about the publication date of the book as the end of the process. But it's really apparent to John, because the work motivates us so powerfully, that it's actually been the beginning of the process, because we get to speak in contexts like this, and we get to continue to develop our thinking around the work. So one of the issues we picked up this week, I think, was the challenge, it was last week, was the fact it thought about the cultural implications of voice and silence, but what perhaps we hadn't touched upon was the global culture issues in terms of voice and silence and the disparities there, which means we have another line of inquiry, which is extremely exciting. I'm going to share 3 stories, just to give rather than just spout about the book, let me just share some stories, which I think will potentially illustrate why it feels important to us and why we're doing work. Now, the first story is my son Thomas, who's 9 years of age, and he's just plodded off to school. So he's in year 4, and he loathes school. He really dislikes school, to the extent that just after Christmas one time, I said to him, "Why don't you want to go to school?" He said, "Well, because it's like a prison for kids, and there's work." I thought, okay, it's kind of Labour camp from your perspective. I remember saying to him in my typical blah, blah, blah style, "Have you been reading Irving Goffman?" Which, of course, drew a very blank look back and said, "What?" And I said, "Doesn't matter, you'll understand it at some stage." And Thomas has a very interesting view. He read the blurb for the book. And Routledge referred to John and I as 2 experts. And Thomas picked it up and said, "Who are these 2 experts?" And I said, "Oh, that's John and I." And he said, "You're not an expert." So people can see the support I get from my domestic setting. Thomas the other day, he came home and he said, "Oh, I got kept in for 2 minutes of playtime," which is a kind of stat punishment. And I said, "Well, what were you doing?" He said, "Oh, I was talking." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I said, "Well, what were you talking about?" He said, "Well, I was chatting to my friend Maya. We were kind of talking about work, but we were just having a chat." And it reminded me that at this point, Thomas is gradually finding his voice. he's quite shy, but he's beginning to find that voice. But of course, in the classroom, there's a lot of silence imposed. A lot of people stop talking, as talking has to be stopped. Talking is very often seen as a misbehavior. But it's interesting that Thomas is happy. He's happy to trade 2 minutes of his playtime for the opportunity to talk to Maya and other children. And it just resonated with me. I thought, well, there's something similar in corporate life as well. We know in certain instances we're not meant to talk, and there's a sense of punishment attached to it sometimes. But for many people, it's important to find their voice and to speak out. And it did remind me, of course, that discussions that Bowles and Gintis had about the correspondence model in terms of education, which is the formal education system that we get, is one that mirrors the workplace quite closely in terms of socioeconomic structures. And that's just to reassure ourselves that we will appear in the sociology bestseller list. I've just mentioned Bowles and Gintis, so that should tick that box. Alongside this, I've had some experience recently in an organization where they're going through a significant change process. And a lot of the workforce is feeling intensely antagonized by that and quite frustrated, and significantly they're feeling angry. Whereas in most kind of staff briefing sessions, the chat box is full of blandishments and polite remarks, suddenly the lid has come off this and people are giving expression to real feelings, and they're giving voice to the situations they face. And it's really powerful to go from a situation where you just expect people to be quite formulaic in terms of responses, to a situation where people are being critical of the organization, some criticism of the leadership, and it's very, very significant to see it because we so rarely see it. And it's interesting because in most corporate experiences, leaders chase their tails constantly, inviting people's voices. So they, can you complete the pulse survey? Have you done your annual staff survey? Have you done this, that, whatever? There's always an invitation to voice, unless that voice is so unrestrained and candid that it feels disruptive to the organization, or feels like it could shake the structures that actually exist therein. And so it reminds us that quite a lot of voice work in organizational settings is about flattening human experience, reducing human experience to an array of numbers, whereas actually, as you sit on the chat box, you're getting raw data from people in terms of their practical experiences of the organization. What intrigues me about that is, in that setting, there is now somebody called the moderator. And the moderator seems to control what questions get carried, and what stories get carried, and what comments get carried. And it's not insignificant that what they're doing is moderating people's voices. And several times recently, there's been quite senior leaders saying, can people watch their tone? And quite interestingly, getting to the point where they actually said, you can't ask the question in the way you've asked it. You have to ask it in keeping the corporate values, which at a quite extreme level for me felt totalitarian. And I'm not going down Godwin's law path of saying they're Nazis. It has a totalitarian aspect to it in terms of understanding that from a socio-political context. So that's intriguing to me. And lastly, to finish up, on my Twitter feed, a woman called June Slater keeps popping up. And I'm not sure how Twitter works these days anymore, but obviously I've looked at one thing that June put up out of interest, and suddenly she's always appearing. June is a retired businesswoman from Manchester. Her position is she's pro-Brexit, she is anti-immigration, she's anti-vaccination, she sees COVID as some sort of conspiracy. So you can see the array of perspectives that June takes. Every time something from June pops up, my first reaction is, oh, I'm just going to block her. And then I correct myself because I think, why has June got this opinion? And who am I to stop listening to that opinion, regardless of how repellent I might feel it? In actual fact, if I blocked her, I wouldn't be privy to a whole conversation and perspective in the world that is different to mine, but which complements mine in terms of opportunity, perhaps, for dialogue blog, and so my thumb hovers over the blog, because I just don't want to see this crap anymore. And then I think, no, let's leave June there. Let's keep the stuff coming, because I need to orient myself to the world. And in the world, there are people taking positions different to mine, and they will express that. I have a responsibility not to just pretend to be listening to it, but actually to hear what they're saying, because notwithstanding anything else, June is speaking about her experience as a human subject. It's my responsibility as a human subject to bear witness to that, to try and make sense of the world. Well, that's a rather pious ending to it. I always thought I could have been a really good Church of England vicar, but I'm going to stop talking now and give my voice a bit of a rest, and I think I pass to John now.
Thanks, Mark. That thing about blocking June and this whole notion of hearing people on their own terms, which sounds, again, it does sound very Church of England, sort of pious, how wonderful to do that. And how incredibly difficult it is to hear people on their own terms when they insist on being heard in a particular monologic way. And last week I was talking to one organization where they are wrestling with the whole area of protected characteristics, and the idea where you have contradictory protected characteristics. So this is, and I'm going to get nervous even as I tread into this water, and I can feel my heart rate going up, and I can feel myself getting a bit sweaty, because I'm going to step into the wonderful world of matters to do with trans rights and also to do with LGBT gender critical rights. And if you wish to walk into a war of intolerance from all sides, that is the space to move into. And engaging with people who are trying to marry people who are often very frustrated. They are both groups which are used to being marginalized, and so therefore are extremely defensive. Right, well, not right, but just understandably so. But, you know, it'd be very easy to say, oh, we need to have a dialogue. But what do you do to have a dialogue when you have two utterly contradictory views and people who are utterly not minded to hear the other? And that is a situation that I think a lot of organizations, particularly around that issue, are stuck around. And I'm really thinking now about, I'm going to step away from that one into something I know more about firsthand, which is we have a silence around charged issues, those that are difficult. Now, I recently was interviewing at a book launch of the work of a friend called Barbara Banda, who is a Black British professional, my sort of era. And during the interview, and this was all, we'd all prepared this and we'd rehearsed it, but so this was largely in front of a Black audience, which for me, and in case you can't see me, and this is on the recording, I am about as white British establishment as you can get, as is both by my appearance and my voice. So there I am, I'm interviewing Barbara, and I say, well, at one point, I say, so what does it feel like to be interviewed by a white British establishment man like me? And she said, well, it feels like, actually, I'm having my skin peeled off me. I feel that there's a kind of inquisitorial edge, though I'm trying not to do that, that is what's being evoked into her. And she went as far as to say, there is a quality of the slave history coming out, which is not something that one normally talks about in polite society. She then flipped it round to me, and again, we had prepared this, and said, what does it feel like as a white British person interviewing a Black British woman in this setting? And I was very struck that this is, again, something that I had not been asked in public before. It is a topic I avoid, that I silence myself, and we have a collusion of silence around it. And what I noticed was I had to slow down. Suddenly, I was having to pay attention to what I was saying with much more care than I would normally, than say if I was interviewing Mark or and sort of people from my gender, my class, whatever, who often dominate senior positions. And you can see why the so-called woke agenda is so disliked by senior leaders, establishment leaders, because it suddenly requires them to work harder, to actually look into the headwaters of their thinking, to step out of the treadmill of just going with what they already know. It's an uncomfortable place to be. And by the way, from a book sales point of view, this is not an easy sell, which is you're saying, read this book and feel uncomfortable, feel incompetent, and have to work harder. This is not what one would call, an easy proposition. It's the opposite of swallow this pill and life will be better. So this whole idea about actually stepping into charged topics. And it's also this function of where I am in my age and my career is I can probably talk about this now because I'm early 60s, I'm financially secure, and if it all goes wrong and I say the wrong thing and nobody ever employs me again, I'll be okay. The risks of speaking up, of not staying silent, are pretty low. And that again is a hugely privileged position, which I think comes with a huge responsibility for people like me to be the ones who are willing to open up and hold the space, not fill the space for these sorts of conversations. Just stepping away from the whole issue of the charged issues that can be talked about, I just want to anchor it back into silence. I'm just going to read the very first sentence of this extremely good book by Mark Cole and John Higgins, The Great Unheard at Work. By the way, there is a discount code available, which I'm sure will be to be shared with you. And the first sentence goes this: silence always has something to say. It's never neutral and speaks volumes if people are willing to hear. Our response to silence is often to dismiss it or end it, to block it out with noise. Instead, silence needs to be taken seriously. And again, it's an impossible task, because that suddenly says, why is this person being silent? And often in organizations, particularly highly controlled ones where people have tight time, where efficiency has taken over. In last night's conversation we had around this, people talked about how the operational efficiency is so tight that if suddenly to pause a meeting and say, actually, I noticed no one's talking, can we explore this, gets in the way of the efficient conversation. But to actually invite silence and know how to invite it in a way that isn't another power play, because it can be quite intimidating if a senior person suddenly turns to you and says, I noticed you haven't said anything, rather than saying, actually, how do I make it okay so the person who's being silent can choose to remain silent or not? Because often silence is the only way that people have to exercise agency. It's a sign that this is the only way they can feel they have some power. And if we're looking at something like the ubiquitous staff engagement survey, and you get this thing of, in most organizations, people fight hard to up the response rate, rather than saying, why is it that people don't want to respond unless we're on them like a rash? Rather than say, could it be that people don't want to answer the questions we want to ask, and they don't want to answer them in this way? Because in many ways, a survey is a reminder of a relational gap. It's the reminder of somebody can't even be bothered to come and talk to me. Instead, they're sending me another wretched survey to fill in, and they're asking me to answer something on a 1 to 5 category number. And I'm just going to finish up now, because we've been sort of talking for a while, is in the book, in a very cynical, calculating way, because I have a real dark side to my character, I decided that we needed to have some numbers in it, because that gave us some face validity, and we knew for various publications we wanted to think they like a number. So we wanted to be able to say, X, tens or hundreds of people feel this about what silence is them, or what they do to silence others. By chance, 35 people in this survey filled in the free text thing we'd done. And they filled it in with often quite lengthy essays. And this was astonishing. And then Mark said, oh, maybe we should take this seriously. And so I'm a professional writer and editor. So I thought, well, I can't trust these people to have written the stuff in their own words well. So I thought, well, I better step in and tidy them up. And at the same time, I could do a thematic analysis. And at the same time, I can edit out those voices which quite actually don't fit. Particularly, let's say there was one white middle-aged man who complained about in his organization how he felt he was discriminated against. And my terribly liberal prevention said, oh, you've been the beneficiary of, however many generations of positive discrimination. You don't have the right to feel what you feel. Fortunately, Mark caught me at this time and said, can you notice how you're silencing people? How you're deciding how they should present themselves? And so what we did in the book in the end was to take all 35 of these. We didn't edit out any of them, even the ones that flatly contradicted what we were saying, which was, some people said, no silence in my organization, we're all as happy as Larry. And I wanted to say, you poor deluded fools. And Mark said, no, that's their reality. Will you stop editing people out? And it is so difficult to actually seriously hear people. And I think, going back and ending by linking back to the June story on Twitter, so I think that's what's happening on the Twitter thing, is that actually it is that experience of not being heard. And it is that really being heard by the other, by someone who doesn't agree with you, but wants to understand you, and not in a patronizing way or a way to fix you, is one of the most powerful first steps one can ever do. It's not going to be a universal cure, but unless we do the work ourselves, which is, if I don't understand you, then quite frankly, I haven't heard you. That's it, Philippa. That was me as, again, a bit of a fired up Church of England priest.
I can absolutely hear the passion in your voice about not being allowed to edit something and improve their words. And, I can hear the frustration. Thank you to both. That's really helpful. What we always want to do on these things is have a conversation. So if you do have questions, please do either put them in the chat or just do the Zoom thing and raise your hand, put the little icon, and then we'll be able to see you. And please do join in. But in the meantime, actually, I don't know which of you wants to respond to it. And Mark, I appreciate you want to also rest your voice. But GameShift is all about doing something really practical, helping to shift stuff. And so what was coming up in my head as I was listening to you both was thinking, okay, so what can I do, whether I'm in a client organization as somebody who's an employee within a client organization, within an organization, or as an external person, or as an internal consultant? What can I do to, if you like, make sure I don't get in the way of organizations not being able to listen to each other? I may have done a double negative in there, but what can I do really practically to get out of the way, or to really help organizations to listen better to each other? Other than obviously directing them to the book, but when you were doing your research, when you were having your conversations, what things really struck you as practical stuff that could be done? Does it need somebody always sitting on a shoulder going, hang on a minute, like Mark did with your potential editing, hang on, we're potentially editing, hang on, we shouldn't let people put things in the chat and only require it to be in line with the particular values that whatever the organization has. Did you come across particular practical instances of how we might be able to help the Great Unheard be more heard?
You're going to go, John, or shall I just quickly throw something in? So there is a practical response. The difficulty with the practical response is it has quite radical implications, because it requires quite a lot of organizational disruption in terms of what we see as traditions in organizational life. So it's not unreasonable to look at communication in organizational settings. It's that kind of CC literature talks about conversation constituting organizations. But so much of what passes for exchange in organizational settings is quite formulaic, is quite performative. perspective is quite structured to the extent that there's little space in anything we call a meeting for people to actually have the conversation. One of the things John and I noticed was that we were having a weekly conversation for about an hour, but what we were diligent about was never setting an agenda and never setting an expectation of what the output would be. Now, of course, this is precisely the sort of perspective that would frighten the horses in most corporate settings, but it is actually the first step to start saying there is a way of having conversations that will feel qualitatively different. Certain stuff happens in meetings. The governance stuff happens in meetings. We know that's the case. But it's about starting to say, if I want a serious exchange with others, I have to just create an opportunity for them to come into dialogue with me. So it's not about, have you got the agenda? It's not about, we expect this meeting to produce this, because that's just a scripted perspective. And so the starting point, and particularly if you are a leader in an organization and have some positional power to make a difference in that sense, is actually inviting conversation to take place, potentially alongside the formulaic ways in which people are going to communicate. And we did a piece of work in the book where John and I were kind of slightly repelled by checklists and models and such like, because they tend to create a shorthand picture of the world and allowed senior leaders to outsource their thinking in lots of ways, whereas in actual fact, our perspective is, for goodness sake, if you are in a leadership position, your primary activity is to think in many ways and to think critically. I suppose that's the second element. It's to say, for all of us to develop in that context, to be the voice on the shoulder, is to address three things in terms of our own practice. These are the three things that for John and I are the way in which actually people need to develop in order to prepare themselves for leadership. So the idea of leadership development is problematic for me, but the idea of developing into leadership is a different perspective. So the three things is criticality, which is I will look at the world with a critical eye. I will look at everything that looks routinized and familiar to me, and I will challenge it in my own mind. And to use a word from fancy French continental philosophy, I will deconstruct it, or allow it to deconstruct everything around me in terms of the corporate life. I will allow to unravel and to look at with a critical view. The second element is reflexivity. So just thinking the way that John described, rather than just reflection, which can sometimes be an abstracted practice where I'm looking at the world. Look at me looking at the world. Whereas, of course, we are all in the world and shaping the world as we reflect on it. And that's why we talk about reflexivity. And then the final is just getting in touch with our ethical self. And of course, that's a glib statement in corporate settings, but being clear about what is it for me that drives my ethics, and where can I ground myself in my ethics? And one of the things I say to lots of organizations with whom I work is look, you keep talking about those corporate values, you keep referring to your corporate values. Have you ever asked the people coming to work for your organization what values bring them to your door? What are their personal values that drive them to work on a daily basis? So that's that ethicality as well. So I think it's small steps, but they are quite radical, because you are saying actually task and finish group, committee meeting. I've got several stories about committee meetings, which are particularly depressing about communication and speech. Those are formulaic and potentially unhelpful in terms of dialogue. So it's about finding other opportunities to engage with human beings that allows ill conversation to take place. That's not a precise recipe for success, but it's a reminder that it's within our gift as individuals to make a judgment about how we support those conversations. John ground this for me. I've got off into an abstracted and theoretical place.
And what a lovely place it is. I've been thinking about this, and it's lovely to say, unscripted conversations, all these sort of things, which I'd absolutely agree on, find more critical space, and this takes time. And of course, time, everyone will say, busyness is the opium of the current corporate culture. And it is this whole thing of, I'm very drawn to the work that was popularized by Alison Reynolds, where she talks about tyranny of the tangible. And I am now getting more and more drawn to the notion that within nearly every corporate setting, we have got a reporting and measurement burden, which is completely out of control. It has become an end in itself, and is actually now, we never look at what is the cost of measurement, what is the cost of reporting. And I think that if I was going to think about how do we free up the space so that people can actually come together, we need to have a bonfire of the reporting, a bonfire of measurement. And it is, I think it'd be quite easy. I don't think, whatever you do, actually don't bring in external advisors on this. I think your frontline people will be able to tell you very, very quickly what are the reports that are useful to them, that actually they know that they are going through the ritual of this, and that there is nothing meaningful actually coming out of this. And it also comes into this notion that actually a lot of senior management are deluded when it comes, they think they have a picture of reality through this wonderful pyramid of reporting piffle that's coming to them. I remember interviewing a guy who was right at the center of the 2007-8 financial meltdown. And he talked about the only people who believed the financial reporting that was hitting the desks of the senior levels of the bankers were the most senior bankers. Everyone on the trading floor knew that the numbers bore no relation. And he had a great explanation for this. He said, it's all anchored in the budgeting system. He says, what happens is you get all the, he was talking about his particular thing, is everybody comes together at the start of the year, all the country heads, and they'd say, okay, what are the revenue targets? And they'd all agree them. And then somebody would have listened to some wretched Harvard person or other who'd have said, but now we need to have some stretch objectives. So, okay, right, we'll add 10% of the revenue targets. Oh, and by the way, we can control the cost base. So take 10% out of the cost base. And then he said, then the lying begins. Because what happens is you go and get the friendliest accounting software you can, you push out the costs as far as you can, you pull the revenues forward, and that's why the financial system blows up every 3 to 5 years, because there's utter disconnect. And it is this fantasy game. And actually Kagan and Lay have this wonderful idea that everybody at work is doing a second unpaid job of let's pretend, which is going along with what the measurement system wants them to do. Well, they actually get on with what they really need to do. And it's until we begin to stop this gap, that will then free us up the time to have these reflexive conversations. I'm just going to say 2 more things before, so that I know I can see all the questions coming through. One is to do with mindset. And it is in our previous book, we talked about habits of mind and myths that we have. And one of this that everything is fixable and that perfection is what we're after. And again, it's this notion that, the notion of good enough, we can't have that because we've got to be excellent. It's rather that actually good enough is the absolute gold standard of organizations. And this desperate desire, we endlessly gild the lily, rather than say, okay, given where we are, where can we naturally progress to? Because that's not dramatic. That doesn't, justify our goal painting. And I'm just thinking of the memory also of a very practical example of a different approach to coaching that I came across with some colleagues who were working years ago. I don't know if Philippa and Chris were involved in this, with the National Institute of Health Research, and they called it accompanying. And this was rather than coaching where you just sat with your client and had the sort of lovely conversation where they told you what they wanted to do and these sorts of things. Somebody would actually follow the senior leader around. And so before they went into a meeting, they say, what do you want to get out of it? And what do you expect to happen? And then they talk about it before and afterwards. And as the relationship between the client and the accompanier grew, then actually the accompanist could walk into the meeting with the client. And actually when the client then, having said, I'm going to behave in a much more inclusive way, I'm going to really listen to people, the accompanist could actually call out the client in the middle of the meeting and say, do you remember what we said you were going to do? And it is this thing of catching people in the moment with what they are actually doing rather than what they espouse. Philippa, that was a long free association in response to your question.
That's really helpful. And in the meantime, you will have seen that there are a heap of messages and comments and questions in the chat, which is great. And as I say, if you also want to speak in real life and kind of put your hand up, then please do, either to ask a question or make a comment. But I think John and Mark, just to be really practical about it, I mean, I think probably the easiest thing is if you can work your way down the questions. That I think it starts with Sarah Bond about asking how we encourage leaders to walk into the space of discomfort. I think maybe for the recording, if you could just say which question you're responding to, and maybe you just take whichever questions. You don't need to both respond to all of them, but just take whichever one speaks to you at the moment, because I think there are now quite a number of questions, and rather than me necessarily deciding, because then I feel like I'm silencing people by choosing some questions and not others. So are you okay if we do that?
Can I make a request on that, which is actually, if you could feed the question, because I find it very, very hard to dual process reading.
In that case, that's
chat.
fine.
And actually, I'll run with you. How do you encourage leaders to walk into discomfort? Oh God, I mean, to me, that's a foundational one, because we touch on ego, we touch on narcissism. And I'm just reminded of an experience of, as part of with some other work I'm doing into activism and activist voices, and again, the way that they get silenced. I remember it was a then managing director for one of the big global tech firms. So he was UK based, and it was just when the Black Lives Matter had just blown up. And he gave me a call. He said, I need to talk through my understanding of this with you, because it's safe. Because, you know, in this dreadfully incestuous way, we'd been at school together, we'd been at university together. He could be clumsy with me. Whereas as if he talked about it within his organization openly, he knew that he was walking on eggshells the whole time. And it is this thing of finding somebody who you can be clumsy with. So I find that my work with Barbara now, I can explore my ignorance with her. But again, you've got to have somebody you can choose. To have it imposed upon you, it's just not possible. And again, it's this notion that I think a lot of senior leaders still carry around within them, which is they need to have answers. It's that needs that to admit that you don't know is really difficult. And particularly within the progressive circles, there's an even more insidious thing. Is someone we were talking with yesterday, who is absolutely at the cutting edge of this stuff, should be about as in touch with the fine feeling of the languages that you can use, said that she felt utterly silenced, because when you're operating at these, real edges of intersectionality, she was so aware that, much as everybody said, oh, we'll tolerate your failure, she said that the mood was 3 strikes and you're out. And so part of this is to allow, is for leaders to choose where is a safe place for me to go to admit ignorance. And then how do you just show up with ignorance well? Mark, do you have something on encouraging leaders? How do they walk into discomfort?
I guess it goes to the notion, and carry with me that there's something of a crisis around the term leadership in the current context, which is causing quite a lot of disruption in corporate life, I think. In particular, it's that sense that leadership tends, as an idea, it tends to shroud particular ways of being in the workplace. So we've traditionally worked on the binary that there are managers and employees. And as soon as you set that up, you have that in mind, there's a clear intimation that there's potentially 2 separate agendas, that the employee may have an agenda and the manager is likely to have an agenda as well. And as soon as you acknowledge that as something that is present, and it has been present in the workplace since FW Taylor and potentially beyond, then you have the opportunity to say, oh, that requires us to at least be in conversation, because if there are 2 agendas, then there has to be a space in which those agendas are discussed. And the manager and employee model tends to reinforce that, and it acknowledges that the potential there is also for conflict. And that can be a productive thing as well, because so often we tend to work diligently to avoid conflict, whereas it may actually be part of the warp and weft of corporate life that needs to be explored. So that binary, the manager-employee binary, is the one that I always hold in mind. And the term leader tends to ideologically shroud that, because I think that is still the function that underlies most workplaces. Because once you start talking about leaders, then we have that binary connection with followership, which is a perspective which, the more you think about it, the more discomforting it becomes, because you're literally saying you are a leader because other people are following you. And that means there's no separate agenda, because people are automatically following what you say. And that requires us then just to accept that we're going to be in the train of this individual. So for leaders to step into discomfort, it's about recognizing that that binary, that way of thinking about relationships in the workplace, is simply unhelpful. And that's an existential challenge for people in leadership positions, because they're trained to think, my presence is this, I do this, I direct people to do this kind of stuff, and then they just follow me in a sort of grand way. If you put leadership into Google Images, you'll get lots of those glib little clip-art pictures of somebody in red pointing and a shroud of blue people behind them following along. So the first challenge is to say to people, if you're stepping into that discomfort, it's about setting aside the notion of leadership and trying not to hide behind that, to think again about, what am I doing in the workplace? What am I expected to do? And how can I work with others to do that slightly better? The other complicated thing for leaders, and I talk to quite a lot of leaders, particularly around the NHS, about the challenge of what gets called system leadership, which again is just another of those slightly glib terms sometimes that floods a room with anxiety, because everyone sits there thinking, well, I don't really understand system leadership. Am I lacking in something? Or it's just something great bureaucrat talking about systems leadership. I'll turn off and look at my phone. But the challenge when we talk to leaders about this is to say, the first responsibility is to kind of unlearn everything you've ever learned about the ideas of leadership, because it's still a very traditional practice. You can go through the Airport Academy, you can look at the thick, stupid books. Some of them are very good, particularly some of them published by Routledge. But you can see these books that you're meant to take to the beach and read, and they tell you all about servant leadership or some new model of leadership. But if you read a daily paper, and I'm old enough to still get a physical paper and read it from cover to cover, then the cultural model of leadership that appears on every page is still extremely traditional, and that's where people take their lead from. It's front pages of politics, it's significant people doing significant things. The business pages are full of chief executives like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Gates, all these people kind of very heroic figures. The sports pages are full of Premiership managers coming and going, and some of them declared as great leaders and others not so much. And so we're still living in a traditional world when it comes to leadership, despite all the different models that notionally exist. So the challenge is twofold. Firstly, unlearn all of that, because the discomfiture is to say, actually, I'm not what I thought I was. I'm not what it says on the tin in terms of you are a leader. I'm something different in the workplace. The second point is just to avoid the quick fix, the checklist, the quick batch of ideas, and to allow your leadership or your management or whatever you want to call it, allow it to emerge from your day-to-day practice. And that's a challenge, because it feels fluffy-edged, and we know that corporate life is geared to do, get stuff out, or show something tangible. But I think that's how we need to coach leaders to think about it. And it is a massive challenge, but you have to start somewhere. And I think for me, those two starting questions about unlearn what you've known and start to see what emerges once you set that aside is a way of embracing discomfort and potentially finding a different way to be present in the workplace.
And I suppose there's the discomfort you were talking about in terms of, Sarah's asked the question about inquiring into the meaning of silence without removing the agency of holding silence, because actually, I might be equally, you're trying to make me heard, but I might not want to be heard for a variety of reasons. That's actually quite a difficult tension to hold between the two. I don't know if one of you wants to say something about that.
Well, it's the and this is where again it's paying attention to the hierarchy and the sort of the silent shadow. So if you're going to inquire into silence, the question is if in a formal setting where you are the most powerful person or thing, is to put yourself in, where is this person going to feel most comfortable? And again, sort of years ago, I published a book, sort of people saying my door is always open, and that was an HBR piece, and that whole notion that is a very double-coded message, which is it's saying you've got to come and meet me on my territory. You've got to come where I'm comfortable, you're not comfortable. And so if you're going to inquire into silence, you've got to think, where would these other people think that they can find their voice? And I'm just reminded of a story of one of the big four accounting consulting firms, and they again were wanting to recruit from much more diverse, particularly ethnically diverse backgrounds. And they had recruited a number of youngsters, of new graduate things, who came from Tottenham in London. So again, they were sort of Black British youngsters. And the partner thought about, wanted to go, so it was again, probably a few years younger than me, but white British bloke, thought, right, where would be a good place to go and meet them for dinner? Because he wanted to show they really appreciated them, their experience. And so he talked to them, actually went to have dinner with them up in Tottenham, their local haunt. So the point was, he needed to go where they would feel comfortable, not where he would feel comfortable. And again, that's inquiring into the silences. People find their voice when you meet them on their territory. Mark.
Just a quick stop. I was working with a leader recently, and they were talking to a staff group, and it was here's a sense of corporate futility. It was a discussion in the meeting about another meeting. So that kind of weird circularity you get in some corporate conversations where they wanted to have a discussion about other meetings, but they dominated the existing meeting to have that discussion. And so the senior leader said, I know we're inviting you to fill in a survey about what you'd like this meeting to be used for. But just because we're having this meeting now, does anybody want to say anything about their thoughts? And what was really interesting was this fantastic silence descended, which seemed to be communicating that nobody had any thoughts, or more importantly, potentially people just didn't want to prolong the discussion and felt that the discussion was taken care of because there was going to be a survey. But for some reason, the senior leader was really motivated to tease this out. So he kept pushing. He kept pushing. Can somebody say something? Has anybody got anything to say? And it was more and more uncomfortable. And eventually, some generous soul on the call broke cover and said, well, since you ask, I think ... And then, like a coiled cobra, the senior leader struck, because he then said, good. Now, I just want to be a devil's advocate and put a counterpoint to that. So suddenly we'd gotten, I'm inviting you to give voice to your positions, to a silence which the person didn't interpret correctly or didn't accept at face value, to a situation where somebody thought, I'll rescue the poor sod and just give them something to go away with. He pounced and kind of tore them apart and put them on the spot and insisted on them speaking. And so it's that story for me. It's a reminder, as John was intimating, to be constantly aware of how I'm present in that situation and what pressures I might be putting on people. And I noticed somebody in the chat has talked about power. One of the ways in which I try to talk about power when I run a session called Unpacking Power is to say, as positional power is important, we know hierarchy is important, particularly in the NHS, it is intensely hierarchical organisation. But it's also the quality of interrelationships with people that power exists in those connections. And one of the ways in which I talk about it is to say it has a normalizing effect, power. It says certain things are normal, which means that once you've defined the normal, anything outside of that is othered. And so this is a straightforward idea from the work of Michel Foucault, who is a French philosopher, and his slightly more nuanced perspective on power. And the workplace example I give is, we know there are introverts and we know there are extroverts. That's a crude definition in some ways. It's an imposition on the world. It may not actually reflect reality, but we have a sense that some people are quieter and some people are more outgoing. If you then look at the workplace, only one of those two states is normalized, and it tends to be the gobshites. People constantly talking, making a lot of noise, working outside, and introverts seem to be othered, not quite the norm. And so I have seen countless people in my life told, why don't you go on a course to help you with your introversion? No one has ever said to the noisy talker, why don't you go on a course to learn how to dial it down a bit and give some space for others to speak? And so again, just the way in which we think about power in that corporate setting determines how we step into that space and manage it in terms of conversation. So recognizing that some people are introverts, and that doesn't pathologize them and say there's something wrong with that person because they don't speak up. I did a 360 feedback thing years back, and one of my managers said in the feedback, I could tell who it was, she just said, Mark lacks confidence in some settings. And I thought, I thought I disguised that really well. So I found a way of having a conversation with her. And I remember saying, yeah, what you should do like me, which is always sounds an alarm as soon as somebody says that. She said, what I do is within the first 6 minutes of every meeting, I make sure I've said something. I thought, oh, that explains so much in terms of what I hear when you're in meetings. So just recognizing the power structures in the workplace is another way of tapping into how am I relating to others, and particularly as a leader, am I avoiding manipulation? Because so much that we see amongst leaders is quite manipulative in terms of forcing voice. Sorry, Philippa, that was meant to be a short intervention, but like all men of my age and gender and, well, race,
that's absolutely fine. And actually, I noticed that Kate's made a comment about the power of being able to choose the conversation and how certain throwaway phrases such as anyway or at least put into a sentence in a particular way can actually be really disempowering. But I'm just interested, Jennifer asked the question about, from the other side, about any tips that you, one or both of you may have. And we do have quite a lot of questions.
Philip is frozen. Okay, Mark, we're going to have to have a look at
what tips should we offer. Was it tips? Oh,
well, I'll have a look at the chat. You have a think. What are your you think about tips? I'll have a look at the questions while Philippa recovers her technology.
Okay. Oh gosh, what tips do you offer? I guess my first tip will be just to be aware of the pattern. So I'm kind of bound to say that, but we kind of live in a liberal democratic circumstance where we presuppose the pattern is soft and manageable and not in the least problematic. So I am constantly, and this may be a deep-seated problem in a psychological sense, but I'm constantly aware of power. I'm constantly processing not just the power around, the power that connects with me, but the power I have in that setting. And I guess the other tip, that one is to pay attention to power at all times, which is part of that criticality. The second is to just to be attentive to voice and to find ways in which you're going to listen differently, which sounds slightly peculiar, but it is a sense in which you think to yourself, okay, I listen, I know how I listen in context. what would it mean to hear? So one of the things we discovered as we wrote the book, we were thinking about the methodology of the book and how do we structure this. And there was a kind of little thread I followed out, which was a research practice called Verstehen. And it kind of appears in Max Weber, and there's a guy called Dilty that did some work on him. And Verstehen simply says, look, you can't understand the human experience by trying to apply scientific principles to it. You have to accept that you listen to human experience, you hear that experience, and you work to understand it. That's the best you can do. And that bifurcation is understanding, or the alternative is trying to interpret. And a lot of the time, what we try and do is interpret people's perspectives, interpret what we said, and we put a distance between us and them so that we can safely do it. And so, as John said in the book, we had to work really hard not to get trapped into that interpretative role, but instead just to look at the raw material and think, well, what are the experiences that made this individual say this in this way? Because that's the only way in which we can engage with what they said. Okay.
Mark, I'm just going to jump in there. It was an interesting experience. I'm going to just read out one of the bits from the chat. And I find this increasingly that when I was reading the chat, I was not listening to Mark. So I heard hardly any of what he said. So it might well be a non sequitur, but it is fascinating. The assumption that one can dual process is, I think, very suspect. And I think that's why I push back on Philippa saying, can you do this? And let me just roll back. I'm just going to read out what Geeta Goldman said. I imagine most of us on this call inherently rate stepping into discomfort in the various way we disable this, part and parcel of our work and the paradigm we swim around in. But it feels so different to others. And I know for some of my uber-stretched, frazzled clients, they're thinking, I've got enough discomfort going on in my role life. How can I create space for any more? It's counterintuitive. And that really resonated with me, which is, I am aware that I have a love of the novel. Present me with a nice stable system or whatever, I will find a way of disrupting it. That's my inclination. And it is, rather than saying people are already full. And I was just thinking, as it was about the inquiry into silence, I'd written down something about time and the need to digest. And again, it is this slowing down, is that we're on this constant treadmill of filling people up. It's almost like those poor old geese, for making foie gras. We're just force feeding everybody. And that's part, I think, of where, particularly in the activist stuff, is suddenly people got to learn, you're constantly having to learn a new language, a new agenda, a new buzzword. And it's this thing. And at the same time, to simply say, I need time to think. I need time to digest. I am too full right now. And it's if we're thinking of Gestalt and the need, we are stuck on this frenzy. And it's quite it's very easy to say, oh, we need to slow down. You take your 5 minutes of mindfulness, and it's a good, it won't do you any harm. It should do you some good. But actually to say, we need to do less. And again, this ramps up into this whole thing of, all the Martin Buber, I, it, I, thou, is we treat our relationships in the work as if they're things, rather than realizing that we constantly go through these structuring things, and we expect ourselves to be able to rebuild these relationships. I build relationships slowly. It takes me a long time to really feel open and trust people. And it's and the change junkies, I think, and I speak as myself, is we've got to be more aware of the emotional load that people are carrying. And particularly, we discount and disappear the emotional load that's going on in the rest of their life. Right now, I've got the space because the kids have left home and they're looking relatively self-sustaining. I have got the time to digest. The emotional burden of the home is not very high on me. And yet for a lot of people, it's very high. And then you up it in the workplace. And I think emotional burden, time to digest, I don't know how we reintroduce the humanity, because if you're all about promoting change, I think you can become an agent of inhumanity. That's not a very optimistic end to it. We got Philippa back.
Yes, I'm afraid I don't quite know what happened to my Wi-Fi then. The one thing that has now happened is that I can't see the questions that were there. So what I can say is that to Doug and to others, yes, we will be saving the questions from the chat. Rick will be doing that, and we will send them out afterwards. But actually, I'm going to ask Chris, just as I know you can see the questions because you haven't gone offline, but would you be able to direct John and Mark to the next questions? I can remember the gist of some of them, but not the details.
Well, I mean, I will try to do that. My Wi-Fi now is back on, so I can see you all. But as I've been listening to this, I've been wondering what does a good outcome look like? You know, what's the end game here of all this work you're trying to do? Because I don't know if I'm an optimist or a negative, a pessimist about organisations, but I do think organisations are, in some ways, you know, we recruit people who fit a culture, we train people to fit a culture, we fire people if they don't fit the culture. How much hearing the unheard do we think organisations really want?
And this is, I'm talking to somebody else, which again is about relation. How do you create a more family-friendly working life? And this whole notion of fitting a culture. Maybe think again, it's about the amount of energy that people have to go in to twist themselves into a shape to fit an organizational norm. And it is, again, who's benefiting from this? And we get into that very suspect cliche of, oh, there's a war for talent. And I don't think there is a war for talent. What there is there's a war for people who are willing to twist themselves so perversely into some arbitrary norm, which somebody else has thought is a good idea. So again, it's this, what would organizations look like if we started as a working position of, let's work with people as they are? And again, it's this whole notion of the competency matrices and all these things again have acquired a life of their own. So we have lost sense of how can we start from the building blocks of people as they are, rather than as we would like them to be. And I mean, it would problematize, because again, we want to have the desire for standardization, the basic Fordist model that has been applied to workplaces which are much more in cliches, knowledge centered. They're it's about conversational quality, it's about innovation and all those things, and yet we're still thinking about things through a largely production line thing where we're looking to try and standardize people and standardize relationships. And how do we step out of what would a non-standardized model of organizing look like? Mark?
Yeah, just thinking about my dad's voice. My dad's voice was the voice of the white working class. It was get a job, do what they tell you, keep your head down. And that kind of occurs to me on several occasions because I feel constantly pressed now to call things out, to give voice, whereas my dad's voice in my head is like, don't give voice, just keep quiet, just do what they ask and they'll give you money. It's a purely instrumental situation. And I do off the back of that sometimes think, could you take away the soppy managers, the ones that have been on the courses and go through some sort of performative way of being? You could just put a taperist in charge, just an old-fashioned manager who doesn't want to hear me speaking, doesn't want my opinion, just want me to do what I'm paid to do. And there is an attraction to that. So to go to Chris's point, for me, it's about not necessarily going in that direction, but saying to people, if you don't want to hear me, please stop asking in that kind of head tilt type way, because I'm kind of sick to death of it. So there's something about my problems that says, if you're asking me to give voice, if you're saying you want to hear me, then have the decency of hearing me. But if you don't actually want to, if it's just a performance, stop asking, because I'm happy to accept it in that way. However, from a kind of OD practitioner perspective, there are two elements there for me. The first is I hold to a political perspective that says there would be some benefit to democratizing the workforce, to democratizing the workplace. And there's a very good book just appeared that sets out a kind of manifesto for that democratization. And one of the key elements, I'm going to struggle to remember who the authors were, but one of the key aspects of that was to say, can we stop talking about human resources? Can we stop talking about employee? Can we talk about labour investors? Because, of course, capitalist organisations talk all the time about their stakeholders and their investors, overlooking the fact that it's the workforce that are investing their labour to make a success of that organisation. So just that simple shift in terms of thinking about what contribution people are making can be helpful. So I do think that there's a purpose to thinking about this kind of activity in terms of creating a better democratised circumstance in the workplace, which will be more satisfying for people, because the research body tells us that people who have high levels of autonomy in their work have significantly greater senses of satisfaction, less churn, less intention to leave, more productive, better performance. So even in the business sense, giving people some autonomy without necessarily constraint is beneficial. And then the second comes out of Carl Weid's book about social psychology of the workplace from 1969, and he made the simple distinction between there's organisation and there's organising. And the bit I'm always interested in is the organising, because that's where you see people coming together and getting stuff done, a shared ambition. And then around that, sometimes wrapped the organisation, which gets in the way, the structure gets in the way of the organising. And certainly off the back of the pandemic, there's several books just been published on the mutual aid activity that came out of the COVID experience and how people came together to get stuff done, and how when organisation wraps around, it can inhibit that. So I think it's about going to that issue, about thinking about the systemic nature of working in contrast to what we accept as structural. And the systemic working is founded on dialogue. And so there is a responsibility for organisations to encourage that dialogue to take place effectively.
And I think I've got the questions now, thanks to Rick being able to send them to me. But one of the things that just strikes me is we've talked quite a lot about leaders and the role of leaders and the energy that it can take for leaders to kind of not use their power and to really hear people, etc. But Patrick has asked a question about peers, and he's wondering whether you've got any thoughts on the extent to which peer pressure prevents people from speaking up, and kind of as a secondary to that, whether on-screen meetings encourage or discourage silence.
Yeah. Oh, the peer pressure stuff is absolutely there. I mean, there's a lovely term which is called spirals of silence. And again, it's the way that we create norms. And I actually, again, in terms of studies within the NHS, came across some really explicit, where it was a whistleblower, which was one king, where somebody walked into a room and all their colleagues just turned their back on them, literally. And so that capacity to that sense of not belonging, when your peers reject you, is very, very powerful. And just linked to that, I was talking to somebody yesterday about a young graduate who was working on the wings of one of the London prisons. And because they want to move into prison care, custodial care. So they've been working there since September, so 6-7 months in. Because they're a graduate, the non-graduate prison warders will have nothing to do with them. So they are completely on their own. Also, they have no manager. they have had no psychosocial support during their whole time there. So this is a young woman, probably about 24, who is responsible for some fairly serious offenders, a wing of 100 people where her peers are doing nothing to look after her. The management is doing nothing to look after her. So that peer pressure creates, this cordon, this boiling up. And just as an aside on that, it links back to Mark about the organising. I coach a matron for one of the intensive care units, again, for one of the London hospitals. And my work with her is about her living the tension between, she is very much motivated by the care. She's one of these matrons who, after some years has got back to the experience of, being visible on the wards and how powerful it is for, the younger people to see her there dealing with what is euphemistically called a code brown, which I think you can all work out what that is. And so she's willing to roll up her sleeves and get in. But at the same time, she is battling with her marginalization by the formal reporting structure. And she's falling between the gaps. So she's not part of the management cadre who are very good at doing the spreadsheet. And she's not part of the full-time people on the ward. And so she hasn't got a peer group to belong to. And when we're talking about the peer pressure, and I'll hand to Mark at this point, is I did a talk recently to the Royal College of Medicine, and it was called, if whistleblowing is the answer, ask a better question. But if you want to have a really horrible life, become a whistleblower in the NHS. You will be marginalized, you will be alienated, people will come after you. And what's even worse is that I then talked to somebody who had been a whistleblower, who then wanted to rejoin the management hierarchy in order to bring their experience. They were then turned on by the whistleblowing community. So there is a complete thing that the peer pressure, the way that groups create their own norms, and as soon as you move to the edge of a group, the marginalization kicks in. And it's so difficult. We use the phrase tempered radical as if it was a nice, easy place to be. It's a horrible place to be. Mark.
Just speaking, there is quite a bit, as John says, around spirals of silence, and just the way in which we all have a responsibility for silencing. So somebody on our call yesterday very, very importantly made the observation that we were focused just on, as Philippa indicated, focused very much on senior leadership and permissions they grant for voice and silence in the organisation. Whereas actually, it's within all of our gifts as human beings in a corporate setting to create circumstances where people feel comfortable to speak, or where they may silence themselves or feel silenced on that basis. And we do. We talk quite a bit in the book about this, the notion of community, which is a phrase that gets used quite a lot in contemporary settings, and particularly that focus on the aspect of unity in community, which is about how community should be about bringing people together rather than fragmenting and separating them. And as John says, there's a very strong sense that just on the basis of our collective existence in various settings, we can end up silencing people, because if you don't say the right thing in that kind of community setting, then you end up ostracized. If you find your voice in it and you're not just saying what is ordinarily said in that community setting, you push yourself into a liminal space where you're then making a decision about, do I recant what I've said and try and get back into my community, or do I spill out into another community? But that liminal space is a really quite uncomfortable one, but it serves the purpose as well of defining the boundaries for those groups. So you have to have people within those communities saying things which run against the traditions within that context in order to set the boundaries of that setting. So there's quite a long discussion in the book about how, at a grassroots level, a lot of the silencing that takes place in a corporate setting is instituted by regimes of silence to which we are all involved and complicit. And it goes to the heart of this notion of power as well, because the power we talk about in all of our books, the power we discuss in that sentence is a power which is a power that acts on me as an object. So I experience power, but I cannot deny the fact that I'm also a vehicle for power. My own power in terms of my exchange with others, and the power that might drop down through me in terms of the organizational structure. And so just recalling that and recognizing that it's not just senior leaders setting silences and giving permission to voice. It resides for all of us in terms of our interactivity with others in those contexts.
I was just to leap in on that. There's a conversation I'm having this afternoon with somebody over in Switzerland who's what she calls, she's had the experience twice now of being mobbing from below. So she, again, trying to get work done, but actually there is a relatively distributed power structure, and her capacity to do her job is actively being undermined by the power of this distributed community to undermine the formal management to do what it wants to do.
That's really terrific. I think we have covered most. We might not have covered off every question that we've got. It might be something that we're able to look at afterwards, and when we send out the recording, and we will do a blog around this. But that's been really fascinating, John and Mark, and we're just coming towards the end. Are there any closing comments that you want to make? Because the thing that's really striking me is that we've talked about power, we've talked about leaders, we've talked about peers, we've talked a bit about the energy that all of this requires and the difficulty that it, this doesn't just happen by having a space and saying, right, everybody can be heard now. Actually hearing people is a very, I imagine, time-consuming and energy-filling thing. I know Doug put in the chat about the GameShift Hangouts, that internal Hangouts that happen once a month. And I know I always feel a pressure. They literally are for an hour, and we just come together and we are in community together. And I know even then, each month I have a sense of, but what might we say? What do we not need to have a topic? It's hard to do that, even amongst people who are, you might say, experienced practitioners amongst it. So are there any closing words that you would just like to say, that the sort of key message you'd like to leave people with from either of you?
I was just checking through my notes that came in. I think I'd repeat the phrase I came out with, is that silence is never neutral. And it's very obvious to a group like this. And it's just a reminder to every group is that, and often the sense we make of silence is our projection. And it is how do I actually find out whether the sense I am making of the silence is my projection or is that other person's experience? And that comes down to, okay, how would I find out what is the meaning of silence in this context? And that will mean, okay, how am I going to do that? Who am I going to ask? Where am I going to go? Where am I going to make it possible to find out? So silence is never neutral. And I just had one very specific thing, which is around the power of non-disclosure agreements, formal and informal. And I think NDAs are a poison that is taking root. And the whole thing is that, and I'm coming across this again with a very dear friend at the moment, where they signed an NDA, and 2 years down the line, a colleague of theirs is now experiencing exactly what they experienced. But there is no formal public record that this is a repeating pattern. So again, the use of formal mechanisms. And one third point is, and there was this thing about particularly poorer people, more fragile working relations. We can assume, those of us who live in the UK, for however weak it is, that our employment rights are relatively good. I sat next to a US lawyer on a panel a month or so ago, and it was to be reminded that people in the US are employed, most circumstances, employed at will, which means you can be kicked out, 2 weeks notice, bang. And it's just the realization of how insecure the employment situation is of so many people around the world. And the idea that insecure people are going to speak up, silence and insecurity go together. Mark?
Thank you. 2 quick points. One was a practical thing which I did get to mention. So in terms of OD work, where I get commissioned to do work these days, I tend to take a quite strong position in terms of saying, I'm not going to do this work unless we talk, first of all, the people that are the target for it. That's quite difficult when you're an internal consultant. It's slightly easier in an external perspective in terms of you can walk away from the work, so the work can't be walked away from. But I've come to a point where I kind of dig my heels in. So a couple of weeks back, there was a clinical group that was suddenly the focus of some work, and people said, we desperately need to do some work with them because they're not being innovative enough. They need leadership development. And my first reaction to that every time is, if the answer is leadership development, are you sure you're asking the right question? And that's a challenge. And it took 12 months to actually develop this project, because I kept getting back to the position I said, I'm not going to do this work unless we actually have a conversation with the in-scope population, because you are saying to me that these people are not innovative enough and they're not showing enough discernment, they're not getting stuff done quickly enough. And then when I did get into some focus groups with these individuals, one of them, they were discussing their experience in a hospital, and they said, the other morning, we were in clinic, there were 3 of us, and by 11 o'clock, we'd seen 200 patients. And that was a preamble for them. And that wasn't an important thing. That was what they wanted to say prior to making an observation. But that was the richest datum I could have, because I suddenly thought, actually, it's not about priorities. It's not about throughput. It's not about elective recovery. It's actually about something systemic. And so a practical recommendation for people, particularly in an OD perspective, is to constantly seek out the voice and not accept the instructions of just one voice, which will probably be the dominant voice.
And Mark, I'm afraid you're going to have to accept the instructions of my voice, unfortunately, because we have reached 10 o'clock. We're really grateful to both of you, Mark, and to John, for coming and talking. Apologies from my perspective, I'm about to go and investigate my Wi-Fi. We do have regular hangouts on a variety of, pop-up events on a variety of topics. So we will send out a list of that with the recording, and we will write a blog around it. But we'd just like to thank everybody for your contributions. It's been really terrific talking with you all this morning. So thank you very much. And bye-bye. And I think wave in the Zoom approved fashion.